I hereby sentence Mr. Kohberger as follows. On count 1, burglary, 10 years fixed, 0 years indeterminate. I also impose a fine of $50,000. Count 2, first-degree murder of Madison Mogan. I sentence the defendant to a fixed term of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole.
This is breaking news, and if you've followed this case at all, you need to hear it. Nearly 4 years after 4 University of Idaho students were killed in their own home, the man who confessed to it all is fighting to take that confession back. Just this year, Bryan Kohberger filed new court papers asking a judge to let him withdraw his guilty plea. The same plea that was supposed to end this case for good. Which means the questions everyone thought were answered aren't. Go back to the night this started, November 13th, 2022. At 2:54 in the morning, a phone goes dark. Not a dead battery. Investigators say it was switched off, deliberately, at that exact moment. For nearly 2 hours, there's nothing, no signal, no trace, no way to know where that phone, or the person holding it, actually was. When it reconnects at 4:48 a.m., 4 young people are already gone. One survivor inside that house has described a moment she still can't shake, standing close enough to see him, frozen, unable to make a sound, unable to move. What stayed with her afterward wasn't just what happened, it was how ordinary he looked while it was happening. That's the part investigators still can't fully explain. This wasn't a stranger to the idea of violence. This was someone who had spent years studying it, researching killers, writing about criminal behavior, learning the exact methods used to catch people like him. So this isn't going to open with the crime scene, or the trial, or the parts of this story you've already heard a dozen times. This is going back to the beginning, to a childhood, an isolation, and a series of warning signs that, in hindsight, were there long before anyone was watching. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly how someone travels the distance between a quiet childhood in Pennsylvania and a house on King Road in Idaho. Before continuing, a quick note. This case involves real victims and real families, and parts of what follows are heavy. This account stays free of graphic detail, but the subject matter is serious. Take care of yourself while watching. And if this is your first time here, this is exactly the kind of case this channel exists to break down. Not for shock, but to actually understand why. Subscribe if that's your thing, and drop a comment letting us know where in the world you're watching from. This is the Idaho College murders, and what really happened. The story does not begin with a knife, or a broken lock, or a house on King Road. It begins decades earlier, in a part of the country most people will never visit, in a home that looked, from the outside, like thousands of others. Eastern Pennsylvania, in the years surrounding Bryan Kohberger's birth, was not a place built for headlines. Small towns strung together along winding roads. Former coal country slowly settling into something quieter. The Pocono Mountains nearby, once known as a summer escape for families from New York and Philadelphia, had become, by the 1990s, something more permanent. A patchwork of year-round communities where people worked ordinary jobs and lived ordinary lives. It was into this setting, on November 21, 1994, that Bryan Kohberger was born to Michael and Mary Ann Kohberger. His father worked in maintenance at the local high school. His mother worked within the school district as well. Nothing about the family stood out. No pattern of trouble, no public record of dysfunction. Just a working household raising 3 children in a town where very little ever happened. Bryan had 2 older sisters, and by every outward account available, his early life looked unremarkable. A boy in a small town, going to school, growing up the way thousands of other kids in that region grew up. There is no dramatic origin point here, no single defining moment that explains what came later. And that, in itself, is part of what makes this so difficult to understand. Whatever began forming inside Bryan Kohberger did not announce itself. It built slowly, quietly, largely unnoticed by the adults around him. The first real signs come from the people who sat next to him in classrooms. Former classmates from Pleasant Valley Intermediate School and later Pocono Mountain East High School describe a boy who did not fit easily into the social world around him. At one point, by multiple accounts, he weighed close to 300 pounds, and he became a frequent target of bullying. Not the kind that leaves a visible mark, the kind that repeats day after day in hallways and cafeterias and gym classes until a person starts to expect it before it even happens. Researchers who study adolescent development have spent decades documenting what this kind of chronic rejection can do to a developing mind. Elevated risk of depression, persistent anxiety, a retreat inward, away from the people who might otherwise offer support. In some cases, a slow erosion of self-worth that doesn't resolve on its own, but instead gets carried forward, quietly, into adulthood. To be clear, the overwhelming majority of children who experience this kind of treatment do not go on to hurt anyone. Bullying does not create violence, but it does shape how a person comes to see themselves and how they come to see the world outside their own head. And in Bryan Kohberger's case, we have his own words describing exactly that process as it was happening to him. As a teenager, Kohberger created an account on an online discussion forum, posting under a username disconnected from his real name. Between late 2009 and early 2012, spanning roughly 2.5 years, he wrote well over 100 posts. Read today, with the knowledge of everything that would eventually happen, these posts read less like the ordinary venting of a frustrated teenager, and more like a slow, documented unraveling. In one post, he described himself in terms that stripped away any sense of value or identity, comparing his own existence to something empty, something without substance. In another, spanning a much longer passage, he wrote about a period of nearly 2 years in which even basic human interactions had started to feel foreign to him. He described hugging members of his own family and feeling nothing behind it, as though he were simply going through the motions rather than experiencing a real connection. He wrote about looking into the faces of people he was supposed to love and seeing, in his own words, next to nothing. Not hostility, not sadness, just a flatness where emotional response should have been. What he was describing has a clinical name: depersonalization. It's a recognized psychological state in which a person feels profoundly detached from their own sense of self, almost as though they are watching their own life unfold from somewhere outside of it, rather than actually living inside it. What's notable is that Kohberger didn't simply exhibit signs of this. He named it himself, using the correct terminology, at an age when most teenagers wouldn't have the vocabulary or self-awareness to identify something like this happening to them at all. And this wasn't separate from his physical experience of the world either. In the same period, he wrote about a distinct, well-documented neurological condition: visual snow syndrome. It's a real medical condition in which a person experiences persistent visual disturbance, a kind of constant static-like interference layered over their entire field of vision, frequently paired with ringing in the ears and heightened sensitivity to light. By his own account, he had been living with this since 2009, and by his own description, it compounded everything else he was already struggling with: the anxiety, the sense of unreality, a growing hopelessness he put into writing himself, in real time, years before anyone outside that forum would ever read it. Picture that combination for a moment: a teenager carrying significant physical weight in a body he did not feel at home in, isolated from his peers, targeted by them regularly, living with a neurological condition that distorted his own vision of the world around him. And underneath all of it, a growing, unsettling sense of disconnection from his own identity, one he was documenting, almost clinically, in his own words, in real time. Whatever friendships he had during this period existed mostly online, at a safe distance from the classmates who had spent years making his daily life difficult in person. It would be years before the rest of the world learned any of this. And when it did, the context around it was very different. In 2025, as Bryan Kohberger's legal team prepared for what was expected to be a lengthy trial, a new detail entered the public record. A neuropsychologist retained by his defense, Dr. Rachel Orr, conducted a formal evaluation and diagnosed him with autism spectrum disorder, specifically level 1 on the diagnostic scale. It's worth being precise about exactly what this was and what it wasn't. This was not a childhood diagnosis. There is no record of Bryan Kohberger being evaluated for autism as a child. No documentation from that period suggesting his parents, his teachers, or anyone around him at the time suspected it. This was a formal clinical evaluation conducted decades later, as an adult, introduced specifically as part of a legal strategy. His defense argued that certain traits associated with the diagnosis, a flat emotional affect, difficulty maintaining eye contact, rigid thinking, could easily be misread by a jury as coldness or as an absence of remorse, when they may have reflected something closer to a neurological difference. That distinction changes how we should understand everything that came before it. We cannot say autism explains the isolation of his childhood, because nobody identified it during his childhood. What we can say is that decades later, in the context of a capital murder case, it became part of the public conversation around who Bryan Kohberger actually was, and how he processed the world differently than the people around him. There's a strange contrast worth sitting with here, one that complicates any simple narrative. About a month before the murders, Kohberger was pulled over by campus police during a routine traffic stop. The interaction is on video, and it doesn't show someone withdrawn, disconnected, or struggling to communicate. He comes across as calm, composed. He answers every question clearly and directly. He maintains steady eye contact throughout. He even apologizes, unprompted, for asking the officer too many questions of his own. It's an almost unremarkable exchange, and it stands as one of the only public glimpses of how Bryan Kohberger presented himself socially, just weeks before everything changed. That contradiction, the isolated, disconnected teenager revealed in his own writing, set against the composed graduate student on that traffic stop footage, is part of what makes him so resistant to easy explanation. He does not fit cleanly into one description. This documentary has to sit inside that discomfort, rather than resolving it too quickly. Because whatever was forming in Bryan Kohberger during those years in Pennsylvania was still incomplete. And the next chapter of his life would look, at least from the outside, like something close to a complete transformation. By his late teens, something shifted, at least on the surface. The heavy-set, isolated adolescent who had once described feeling hollow in his own writing began an intense, sustained physical change. Over a relatively short window of time, he lost more than 100 pounds. Reporting on his life during this period describes a rigorous, highly disciplined lifestyle. A strict vegan diet, followed with precision, demanding workout routines, long-distance runs that he tracked and logged himself, local martial arts training as well, adding another layer of structure to his daily routine. On the surface, it reads like a familiar transformation story, the bullied teenager reinventing himself through sheer will. But that framing misses something underneath it. Losing that weight did not undo the years of isolation that came before it. It did not rewrite the depersonalization he had described in his own words, and it did not reverse whatever sense of disconnection he had felt toward the people closest to him. A changed body does not automatically produce a changed mind. What that transformation appears to have given him was something else entirely: control. A structured, measurable, self-directed way to reshape at least one part of his life that had, for years, felt completely outside of his hands. But the parts of his life that depended on other people, specifically building close relationships with women, remained difficult well beyond this period. By multiple accounts, Kohberger continued to struggle here into early adulthood. Reporting describes him matching with women through dating apps during this time, conversations that would often begin normally enough before breaking down quickly. It would be easy to flatten this into a simple label, to describe him using internet shorthand for a man bitter about romantic rejection. But that framing oversimplifies what people who actually knew him at the time describe. Journalist Howard Bloom, who spent years investigating this case in depth, has directly pushed back against that narrative, noting that Kohberger did have a close female friend during this period, someone other students at the time recognized as being connected to him socially. This was not someone who avoided people entirely. By these accounts, he was someone who kept trying, and who repeatedly found himself unable to sustain what he built once he found it. That distinction matters if we want an accurate picture rather than a convenient one. Not a man with no interest in connection, but a man who appeared to want it, and who consistently struggled to hold on to it once it was in front of him. That unresolved tension, a real desire for closeness, paired with a repeated inability to maintain it, carries forward into the next phase of Bryan Kohberger's life. A phase that would eventually take him out of Pennsylvania entirely and into a field of study that would place him directly inside the very framework used to understand people like himself. By the time Bryan Kohberger left Pennsylvania behind for good, he was no longer the isolated teenager who had once described himself as feeling hollow and disconnected from everyone around him. Somewhere along the way, that version of him had been replaced by someone with direction, ambition, and a very specific academic focus. He enrolled first at DeSales University, pursuing a master's degree in forensic psychology, studying the minds of violent offenders. From there, he moved further west into a doctoral program in criminal justice and criminology at Washington State University, where he also worked as a teaching assistant, standing in front of undergraduate classrooms while continuing his own research behind the scenes. On the surface, this reads like a genuine success story, but let's stop there for a second, because this is where the story takes its darkest turn. While Bryan Kohberger was studying the psychology of violent offenders, learning exactly how investigators build behavioral profiles, how crime scenes get interpreted, how criminal minds eventually get understood by the people trained to catch them, he was, according to his own later guilty plea, simultaneously preparing to become the kind of subject his own coursework existed to explain. This is not a new pattern in the history of violent crime. Other offenders have shared this same unsettling closeness to the field designed to catch them. Ted Bundy studied law and developed a working understanding of criminal investigation procedures years before his crimes were fully connected to him. Richard Speck's case has been studied for decades inside the same academic circles Kohberger was now part of. Elliot Rodger's own writings have been picked apart repeatedly by researchers trying to understand what drives certain offenders toward specific categories of victims. Each of these cases, separated by decades, shares one uncomfortable thread: an interest in violence that existed long before the violence itself, developing not in secrecy, but often out in the open, inside academic settings, under the cover of formal study. Kohberger's own academic writing reflects this same interest, and this part is documented fact, not speculation. In coursework connected to his graduate studies, he wrote specifically about stabbing, describing it as an especially emotional form of homicide, distinct from a shooting in the physical closeness it demands between an offender and a victim. Read in isolation, it's the kind of observation that belongs entirely within the normal boundaries of academic criminology. Read afterward, in the context of everything that eventually happened inside that house on King Road, it reads very differently. None of this, taken alone, explains what came later. Thousands of people study criminology every year without ever posing a threat to anyone. But it does tell us where Bryan Kohberger's mind was spending its time during this stretch of his life. And it sets the stage for what investigators would later piece together from the months leading directly into November of 2022. Before we go further into that timeline, if this kind of deep, fact-based case breakdown is what you come here for, now's a good time to hit subscribe. There's a lot more of this case still ahead, including how it's still unfolding right now, in 2026. That period, the months just before the murders, is where the pattern in Bryan Kohberger's behavior begins to sharpen into something far more difficult to explain away as coincidence. Cell phone data recovered by investigators showed that Kohberger's phone connected to a cell tower near the King Road residence on multiple occasions in the weeks and months leading up to that November night. Exactly how many times remains openly contested, even now. Different reports, drawing on different portions of the same underlying data, have placed the number anywhere from about a dozen occasions to more than 20. Rather than settle on one figure to make the story tidier, it's worth being upfront about that range, because the uncertainty is part of the honest picture here. Whether the true number sits closer to 12 or closer to 23, the underlying pattern investigators identified stays the same either way. A phone belonging to a man with no known personal connection to that residence, appearing in its vicinity, again and again, in the lead up to a night that would permanently change the lives of everyone connected to that house. During this same stretch of time, a separate pattern was quietly forming inside Kohberger's professional life at Washington State University. As a teaching assistant, he came into regular contact with undergraduate students. According to multiple reports, several female students who interacted with him during this period found his behavior toward them uncomfortable. Witnesses at the time described him as rude, dismissive, and unusually intense in interactions that should have remained routine. In one documented incident, he was formally reported to university authorities after following a female student to her car. Separately, other students alleged he graded female students more harshly than their male classmates. No single one of these incidents proves anything definitive on its own. But together, they describe a man whose conduct toward women in his own professional environment was already quietly drawing concern, months before the world had any reason to know his name. There is also a specific claim connected to this period that deserves direct treatment. A report published by People magazine alleged that Kohberger had visited a restaurant in Moscow called the Mad Greek, where two of the eventual victims, Madison Mogen and Xana Kernodle, both worked as servers. The owner of that restaurant, Jackie Fisher, responded publicly and did so more than once, calling the reporting completely fabricated in a statement released shortly after the article came out. This is not a case of some people have pushed back. This is a direct, on-the-record denial from the person with the most first-hand knowledge of who actually walked through that restaurant's doors. This claim is included here strictly for transparency, so viewers understand what has circulated publicly around this case, not because it holds up as confirmed fact. What is confirmed, independently reported by both CNN and People, based on a direct review of Kohberger's now-deleted Instagram account, is that he followed all three female victims, Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, and Xana Kernodle, on that platform sometime before the murders. According to that same reporting, he also sent multiple direct messages to Kaylee Goncalves specifically, none of which, according to available records, ever received a response. Taken individually, none of these details proves intent or guilt on its own. A teaching assistant with poor professional boundaries doesn't automatically become a killer. A phone repeatedly pinging near a residence doesn't, by itself, prove someone was inside plotting harm. Following someone on social media doesn't establish criminal responsibility. These are ordinary, if uncomfortable, human behaviors that happen constantly without ever leading to violence. But this documentary isn't built on any single one of these facts standing alone. It's built on the pattern they form together. And here, in the months stretching from late summer into November of 2022, that pattern becomes difficult to look away from. A man with a documented academic interest in violent offenders, who specifically targeted young women. A man whose professional conduct toward female students was already quietly raising concern. And a man whose own phone was repeatedly placing him near the exact residence where those same fixations would eventually collide with four real, living people who had no idea any of this was happening around them. That is not proof of what was coming. It cannot be treated as proof, but it is, unmistakably, the visible shape of something building steadily toward it, one quiet, disconnected detail at a time, long before anyone understood what all of those details would eventually add up to. By the second week of November 2022, everything that had been quietly forming for years was about to converge on a single night. And the record of that night, pieced together from cell phone data, surveillance footage, and the statements of the people who survived it, is documented down to individual minutes. At 2:54 in the morning on November 13, 2022, Bryan Kohberger's phone disconnected from the cellular network near his apartment complex in Pullman, Washington. This detail matters, and investigators would later spend considerable time establishing why. Digital forensics experts who examined his devices after his arrest determined this wasn't a dead battery, and it wasn't a random dropped signal. Wi-Fi and cellular data had both been deliberately disabled, in a specific sequence, the kind of shutdown that doesn't happen by accident. One forensic analyst who worked the case would later put it plainly, turning off a phone isn't enough to avoid detection. You have to disable Wi-Fi, disable cellular separately, then power down completely. That is, according to investigators, exactly what happened at 2:54 that morning. From that moment forward, for close to 2 hours, there is no trace of that phone anywhere on the network. No location data, no calls, no background activity of any kind. Surveillance footage from the neighborhood around King Road fills in part of that silence. A white sedan, later identified as a 2015 Hyundai Elantra registered to Kohberger, was captured on camera approaching the residence. According to that footage, the vehicle circled the block more than once before coming to a stop. Investigators pieced together a timeline showing the car remained in the immediate vicinity of the house for approximately 13 minutes total. Within that window, the time actually spent inside the house was far shorter, approximately 9 minutes, based on the timeline investigators later presented. 6 people were inside the King Road residence during those 9 minutes. Kaylee Goncalves and Madison Mogan, both 21, lifelong best friends, were together that night in Madison's bedroom. Xana Kernodle, 20, was in her own room with her boyfriend, Ethan Chapin, also 20, who was staying over. 2 additional roommates, Dylan Mortensen and Bethany Funke, were elsewhere in the house. According to the reconstructed timeline, the attack began sometime shortly after 4 in the morning. What followed happened extremely fast. Investigators who worked this case have described it as one of the most severe crime scenes they encountered in their careers. Out of respect for the victims and their families, this account is not going to walk through what occurred inside those rooms. What matters for understanding this case is the sequence of events and the timeline, and what that timeline tells us about how a night that began with 2 intended targets ultimately claimed 4 lives. At some point during those minutes, based on statements later given to police, Xana Kernodle appears to have woken and encountered Kohberger somewhere inside the house. What happened in that specific moment doesn't survive as a clear, documented account. But investigators believe this encounter marked a shift, turning what had, up to that point, looked like a targeted attack on 2 people into something that ultimately took 4 lives. One of the 2 surviving roommates, Dylan Mortensen, later told investigators she woke to sounds she didn't immediately recognize, sounds she initially assumed were coming from a gathering elsewhere in the house. According to her statement, at some point she opened her bedroom door and saw a figure she didn't recognize, someone dressed in dark clothing, moving through the house toward an exit. She has since described being completely frozen in that moment, unable to speak, unable to move, watching a stranger walk directly past her and out of the home. What happened over the following hours remains one of the least resolved parts of this case. According to phone records later entered into the court record, the 2 surviving roommates did not contact emergency services until close to noon that day. Several hours after the attack is believed to have occurred. Records show attempts were made earlier that morning to reach the other roommates by phone and text, none of which were answered. The full explanation for that gap has never been publicly resolved. Out of respect for what those 2 young women experienced, this account isn't going to speculate further. Meanwhile, Kohberger's own movements after leaving the residence were being recorded by the same digital infrastructure that had gone silent for nearly 2 hours. At 4:48 that morning, his phone reconnected to the network, this time on the outskirts of Moscow, heading toward Pullman. Surveillance cameras picked up the same white Hyundai Elantra entering Pullman from the south at approximately 5:26 a.m. Additional footage, captured minutes later, places the vehicle back near his apartment complex. What happened almost immediately after he returned home is one of the more unsettling details investigators uncovered, not because of anything violent, but because of how ordinary it looks on paper. At 6:13 that morning, Kohberger called his mother. She didn't answer. 1 minute later, at 6:14, he called his father, also without success. At 6:17, his mother returned the call, and the 2 spoke. Researchers who study violent offenders have documented, across many separate cases, a capacity in certain individuals to move between extreme acts and completely ordinary behavior with very little apparent friction. Family members of offenders in other well-known cases have described this exact disconnect afterward. someone who seemed entirely normal in the hours immediately surrounding events that would later come to define the rest of their life. Whether Kohberger's calls to his parents that morning represented an early attempt at an alibi or simply a return to routine is something investigators have never definitively determined. But the timing alone, calling his parents within roughly 2 hours of leaving that house, remains one of the more difficult details connected to this entire case. For several weeks following the murders, the investigation continued without a confirmed suspect. On November 25th, a forensic examiner working the case identified the vehicle seen near the residence as a white Hyundai Elantra from a specific range of model years. 4 days later, on November 29th, a Washington State University police officer separately identified a white 2015 Hyundai Elantra, registered to a graduate student in the university's own criminology program, Bryan Kohberger. It was the first time his name entered the investigation in any official capacity, nearly 3 weeks after the murders had taken place. Around this same period, forensic teams processing the crime scene recovered a knife sheath found at the residence. Touch DNA collected from that sheath, not blood, but genetic material transferred through skin contact, would become one of the most significant pieces of evidence in the entire case. Investigators submitted that sample for investigative genetic genealogy, a technique that cross-references crime scene DNA against public genealogy databases to identify likely family relationships, even when the suspect has no DNA sample on file anywhere. That method led investigators toward Kohberger's extended family. On December 27, 2022, investigators recovered discarded trash from outside the home of Kohberger's parents in Pennsylvania. DNA extracted from that material was compared against the sample from the knife sheath and linked to Kohberger's paternal line. 3 days later, on December 30th, 2022, Bryan Kohberger was arrested at his parents' home in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania, roughly 6 weeks after the murders had taken place. He was formally charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary. For more than 2 years afterward, the case moved through pretrial hearings, evidentiary disputes, and repeated delays, building toward a trial widely expected to determine whether he would face the death penalty. Then, on July 2, 2025, in a development that surprised many who had followed the case closely, Bryan Kohberger entered a guilty plea to all charges. In exchange, prosecutors agreed to take the death penalty off the table. As part of the agreement, Kohberger also waived his right to appeal. On July 23, 2025, 3 weeks later, Kohberger was formally sentenced. Judge Stephen Hippler handed down 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, along with an additional 10 years for the burglary charge. During that hearing, family members of the victims delivered statements directly to Kohberger. Kohberger himself did not address the court, offering no explanation and no account of what had happened inside that house. For many following this case, that plea and sentencing seemed to close the book, at least legally, on what had happened inside the King Road residence. But this case has continued to develop, even after that sentencing appeared to bring it to a close. In the summer of 2026, Bryan Kohberger, now representing himself in court without legal counsel, filed a formal petition for post-conviction relief in Ada County District Court, asking a judge to allow him to withdraw his original guilty plea. In that filing, he claimed he had received ineffective counsel from his original defense team and stated he had been convinced to falsely confess to a crime he now says he did not commit. Legal experts who have reviewed this petition describe it as an extremely significant long shot under existing law. During his original plea hearing, Kohberger was directly asked by the judge whether he was pleading guilty because he was, in fact, guilty, and he confirmed under oath on the record that he was. Legal analysts point out that sworn, on-the-record statements made under those circumstances carry substantial weight in any later proceeding, and that overturning an accepted guilty plea requires meeting an extremely high legal standard, one that very few petitions of this kind ever successfully clear. As of now, that petition remains unresolved, working its way through the same court system that accepted his original plea just 1 year earlier. So we're left, even now, with a case that refuses to fully close. A confession that was supposed to be final, now formally being challenged from within the same legal system that accepted it. A motive that has never been publicly explained, not by Kohberger himself, and not by anyone else with direct insight into what was happening inside his mind on the night of November 13, 2022. And a long series of decisions, stretching back to a childhood in a quiet Pennsylvania town, through years of academic study inside the very field built to explain violent behavior, and into a pattern of conduct that intensified steadily in the months before that November night, together sketching the closest outline we may ever have of how someone travels the distance between studying violence from behind a desk and walking into a house to commit it. This documentary has not set out to excuse anything that happened inside that house. Nothing about childhood isolation, unresolved psychological struggle, or academic interest in violent behavior removes responsibility for what occurred, or lessens what was taken from 4 families who will carry this for the rest of their lives. But understanding how those individual pieces connect, the early withdrawal, the fixation that slowly formed around the very field meant to explain people like him, and the pattern of behavior that escalated in plain view long before anyone recognized what they were seeing, remains the closest thing we have to an answer for a question that, in a strictly legal sense, may never be fully answered at all. If you want to go deeper into the parts of this case still unfolding, including this fight over his guilty plea, that's coming in a separate video. Subscribe if you want to be here when it does, and let us know in the comments which part of this case has stayed with you the most.